Welcome to this pre-user check 373 video on the Corpuls patient monitor. You've already been through the orientation package, so you're very well aware of the three sections and all the bits that we're going to have a look at. But now we're going to go through the 373 step by step and look a little bit closer at some of those important functions that we need you to be able to remember. You will see me refer to this document throughout this video, and this is the 373 checklist. There is one available for all of the big bits of electromed, so particularly the Corpuls and the ventilator. The checklist is a really good way of remembering all of the steps that you need to go through for the 373 so that you don't forget anything that's really important and particularly anything that's safety critical. The checklists are designed for you to go through them step by step, so literally start at the top and work your way through and follow all of the instructions. The great thing about checklists is they remove that cognitive burden from yourself of having to remember silly things like which button do I press next, and you can concentrate on learning the really important stuff like how to apply this to the patient, how to use the ECG, the defib and so on. So you will see me refer to this periodically, but I won't be going through it step by step, but we would expect you to be able to do that for checking this kit in real life. So from the orientation video, the Corpuls splits into three component parts. And as with all good 373s, the first thing we're going to start with is dirt, dust and damage. So we're going to go through all three parts and confirm that they are fit for use and that there's no serviceability issues that we need to deal with. So starting with the monitor. So the monitor itself, you'll notice has a plastic cover on it. That's just really to protect the screen from getting stabbed with anything sharp. So just check the integrity of your screen and make sure that that all looks serviceable. Go through your buttons and again, just check that no one's stabbed a pen or a scalpel or something through them to make them unserviceable. Round the back, you'll see that we have our connection parts. So these are the bits that are going to communicate with the batteries between all three parts. So just make sure that there's no dust or any dirt stuck in there that would prevent the communication. We also have our little infrared windows. Again, this is how they're going to communicate, particularly when they're not all put together. So just make sure that nothing's occluding any of those parts. The battery housing down here, you can remove the batteries. They are quite tricky to take out. You're going to have to sort of pinch the two clips on either side, and then what we tend to do is sort of bang the screen a little bit just to remove the battery. They are quite tricky to remove. You don't need to remove them routinely. Just have a good look on the outside. Make sure that no battery acid is leaking out or that anything looks unusual or that they're bulging out from their site. If we are placing this bit of kit on an aircraft or a helicopter, then we will be removing the batteries and just confirming that they are fit for purpose before reapplying them. But for the land use, you shouldn't need to really remove the batteries too much. You've got your charging point here. When the Corpuls is all together in its three component parts, it will charge as one unit, but you can also charge each item individually if you need to. So there's your charging point. Down to the base, we have our paper, and this paper, just check that you've got enough for a start and that it's seated nicely. We usually just pull out a little bit ready for our checks and then it's good to go. And then finally is having a look at your MDSS sticker, confirm that it is in date and that it should be good to use. To the defibrillator. You will notice that this has its external paddles connected. You may find that those have been removed and you're just concentrating on the patches. That's absolutely fine. If your unit SOP says that you're not going to use the external paddles, then just make sure that they're available in a box somewhere out of the way, because there are some niche requirements where the paddles would be useful. But we will go through checking the paddles here because for this module, obviously they're connected. So again, dirt, dust and damage, we're going to go through and make sure that this all looks serviceable. We do have a bit of dirt on here, but obviously you could give it a bit of a clean. They're suitable for just be cleaned with Clinell wipes if needs be. On the front here, we have a off and on button, and we've got those same connection ports that you saw on the back of the monitor. So again, just make sure that they're nice and clean and intact. we have our red master cable down here at the bottom. Now there's some really important things to check on the red master cable, because this is the thing that's going to connect your patches and enable you to defibrillate a patient. So it's really important that we check that this is serviceable. To remove the red master cable, we're going to pinch the two red parts of this sort of housing jacket, and then we pull them backwards, and the red master cable can be a bit stiff, but it should just come out. And once it's out, we're going to make sure that there isn't any dirt crusted up in there preventing it from working. And really importantly are these two little white clips, which can be quite delicate and will break if people just pull the red master cable out without any thought to this jacket that holds it in place. Make sure that they're intact, because if they are loose or broken, then the connection to the patches may fail. Once you're happy with the master cable, then just replace it back into its housing. And we'll have a look at the patches here, which come held in by two magnetic clips. So just make sure that you have those magnetic clips for a start, and just make sure that they're serviceable. The reason why a lot of these bits of kit have clips and removable items like this is so that you can clean underneath them. It's so that stuff doesn't get stuck underneath that you're unable to clean. Check your patches, so these should be in date, which luckily these ones are, and these are to be used for anyone greater than 20 kilos. So they can be actually used for paediatric patients. They're specifically called Corpatch Easy rather than Corpatch Adult because of that weight restriction of greater than 20 kilos, which you can see here in this little box referring to the size of the patient that you can apply these to. So we'll pop those back in. You should have a carry handle, and just make sure that if you lift that up, the whole thing doesn't fall apart. And if you are using the paddles, then to remove them, they're a twist towards you if you're facing the defib, and then they will just pull out. So twist them towards you and pull them out. And just give these a look to make sure that they haven't got some, these are a bit scratched, but make sure they're not really scratched so that you can see bare metal underneath. And make sure that the cable itself looks like it's in good service. This is a biphasic defibrillator, but you'll notice that they are labelled sternum and apex. So you have your sternum orange and your apex green. So they are interchangeable because it's biphasic. You could mix them up. The only advantage of keeping them together like that is it orientates your cable in such a way that if you remove that red master cable and apply it straight away, it's good to go. So it saves a bit of faff, and for those of us who have a bit of OCD, it just looks tidier. The defib itself has a tilt mechanism, so you just push it back. What this is for is that when it's all connected, it just gives you a slightly different angle to view the monitor if you need to. Again, there is a battery in this, and the tilt function gives you a view of the battery, which is at the base. And in the same way as the monitor, there's no need to routinely remove these if there isn't any evidence of cracking or leakage of battery fluid. We're going to go through the patient box. Now this is probably the most long-winded part because we're going to have to take out every single cable, make sure that it's good to go. And then when we move into the functional checks, some of those cables we're actually going to check physically that they work. So you'll notice that the the patient box comes in its own bag. So first things first is to remove all of the plugs so that we can remove the the box from its bag. So make sure everything's unplugged. And then just some Velcro on the top and remove the box itself. The great thing about this bag is it keeps everything nice and neat and tidy, and also it's machine washable. So if it does come into contact with the patient or bodily fluids, then it can be washed at 30 degrees if needs be, or you can get replacements through stores. So the box itself, you'll notice it looks kind of similar to a lot of the functions we've seen on the other two parts. We've got our connections, we've got our infrared port, but we have a new little window here, which is actually our kind of auxiliary monitor. So if we have a failure with our monitor, then we can see monitored observations on this little liquid crystal display screen. It will give it in text rather than any waveforms, but it's a great little backup for if you have any problems or failure with your monitor. On the back, same as the other two parts, they have their own individual charging points. So if you have extra plugs and you need to plug them in separately, then you can do. And our battery housing at the bottom, exactly the same as the other two bits. Just check that it's not damaged or leaking. On the right-hand side of the box, we have underneath this little magnetic clip, we have a memory card. This is a 2 GB memory card, and this is going to store all the data. So in line with current standards of electromed in hospitals, they need to have a data log to make sure that you're pressing all the right buttons and all the right things are going on. Currently, that information can be downloaded by MDSS, but it's not something that we are routinely looking at. And on our left-hand side, we're just going to make sure that all the ports look like they're nice and intact. Moving on to the leads. So starting on the right-hand side of the patient box, we have our monitoring ECG. So this is a 4-lead ECG for obviously continual monitoring of your patient. Make sure that it's nice and clean, that the integrity of the leads are all good, and just take specific notice of the clips. Okay, sometimes we do find bits of patient, let's say, still in clips, so give them a good once over and make sure that they're good to go. The next pocket along is our SATS probe. Your Corpuls should come with a finger probe, a standard finger probe, and also an ear clip. Moving on to the final pouch, we have our diagnostic ECG. So in the lab environment, you will have an ECG machine, a standalone ECG, but the Corpuls is actually a really good ECG, and you can perform a very effective 12-lead using it. So in addition to your 4-lead from your monitoring, you're going to add in the remaining 6 leads from your diagnostic ECG to make a total 12-lead ECG. One safety point though with this lead is that as we're going through our 373, you'll notice that I've plugged back in the leads into the box so it's ready to go, but I am going to leave the diagnostic ECG unplugged. And I'm going to do that because I'm going to be testing the defibrillator. Now, there is a theoretical risk, which is documented in the manual, that if this diagnostic ECG is not physically connected to a patient, then there is a theoretical risk of there being arcing of electricity through one of these electrodes. So the manual actually recommends, if you're testing the defib or using it without these connected to your patient, then this should remain unplugged from the box. So you're just going to have to remember to plug it in if you do need to perform an ECG. You've also got some little pouches here which are really useful for storing things like ECG dots, and we would recommend that you just check that you've got enough ECG dots to perform a 12-lead ECG should you need to. The left-hand pouches of the patient box, the first bit here is you have a little pouch for your P1 to P4. Now, it's a tiny pouch, so you would think that you're not going to be able to get everything in there, but in there you should find as many connectors that you need for as many invasive pressure leads as you're going to use. So believe it or not, you can put four invasive pressure connectors in there, and we would usually store 3, so a double and a single. While you're there, while you've remembered that you've got those, it's worth also checking your invasive leads. So take these out of the bag and confirm that you've got as many invasive leads as you require. The Corpuls can monitor up to 4 invasive leads, but most of the time we're only going to be monitoring 3. So make sure you've got it all. The pouch at the back is for our temperature probe. Standard temperature probe with a connector here, and make sure that you have enough please don't reuse them. Make sure that you have enough dots for the skin, and also we have the invasive lines for esophageal or rectal, definitely not to be reused. So make sure you have that lead. That lead is a sort of an auxiliary jack type plug-in, and we wouldn't recommend that this remains plugged in just because of the angle that zipping up the pocket places the lead. It can easily fray and break, so don't plug this in unless you actually need to use it. Our final pouch houses our end tidal CO2 monitoring, which you'll notice is a side stream monitor. Okay, it clips into its cuvette on the side, and in its pocket it lives in a little housing, which if you place it in the housing with the two blue arrows facing each other, then you'll find that you won't get any alarms whilst the end tidal CO2 is not in use. And then in the final pocket, we have a standard blood pressure cuff. So this one is an adult long standard. You can obviously get pediatric and larger cuffs and calf cuffs if you need them. Once you've finished going through all the physical checks of your 3 parts, we're going to place the machine back together and move on to our functional checks. So first things first is the patient box clips onto the back of the monitor, and then the whole bit just clips on to the defib itself. That's worth having a practice of that when you get your hands on with the kit, because it can be a bit fiddly. Once it's all back together, then we'll move on to our functional checks. What we're going to do with the functional checks is confirm that the Corpuls switches itself on and that it runs through its post-on self-test. So first things first is just press the off and on button. You'll see that the jog dial lights up briefly and the screen comes on and it runs through its own little self-test. Move on to checking the defibrillator, and there's a number of safety points that we need to bear in mind here. We're going to make sure that we never test the defibrillator when we're on our own, so make sure there's always someone around just for safety. Make sure the Corpuls isn't plugged into the mains, and when we're handling this red master cable, we're not going to handle it whilst the defib is armed, and I'll show you that as we go through. We already confirmed that our white diagnostic ECG plug is already unplugged because I didn't plug it back in after our checks. The first part of the check is using the manual function here. Is we're going to confirm that we can charge up the defibrillator and that we can also disarm it. So if we press the defib button, you'll notice that the defib function comes up at the base of the screen. And first things first, it's worth just confirming that all the soft keys function correctly. So the first option here is a metronome. So you can, if you choose to, you can listen to the metronome to confirm that it is correct and that what it sounds like is useful to listen to. You should have 2 options in there for adult and child. Our next button is our sync function. So it should be set on auto sync. That just is a nice feature from the Corpuls that means that the defibrillator will always try and automatically sync if you're defibrillating or if you're cardioverting. It's quite clever and will try and do the correct thing for you. Soft keys to automatically select jewels. So we have a 50 button, a 100 button, a 150 button and a 200 button. So just confirm that they function correctly. We have a time elapsed, so really useful for any scribes during a resus scenario. We have a time elapsed since the defib was switched on. We also have the number of shocks that are delivered, which are obviously 0 at the moment, and we have time from the last shock. So a really useful tool to give you that 2 minutes for your resus scenarios. So first things first is we're going to charge up the defib. So it's set at 200. We're going to charge it up, and you'll see that our charging indicator starts to raise. When you hear that alarm, what we're going to do is we're going to press the monitor button to disarm that defib. Okay, you can either sit and wait and it will disarm itself, or you can press the monitor button to take you back through to that main screen. So that's the first test complete. We've confirmed that the defib can charge and then we can disarm it. This is the safe screen. Okay, this defibrillator isn't active at the moment, so we're going to just double check that our red master cable is seated correctly. This housing actually simulates a defibrillator box, so similar to the boxes, the external boxes that you attach in hospital. This is our kind of test and dumping box. All right, so just make sure that your red master cable is seated correctly. and move into test number 2. So test number 2, press your manual defib button. This time we're going to simulate shocking through the patches. So this time we're going to charge up the defib at 200 joules. And we are going to press and hold the shock button to tell the machine to deliver a shock into that safety box at the bottom. You'll see that it's registered one shock has been delivered, and that countdown for the next shock has started. We're going to press and hold that for a short time, just because that's related to our auto sync function, because it's going to just double check that there isn't any electrical activity that would indicate that the patient needs cardioverting rather than defibrillation. So just press and hold, and in a matter of seconds it will shock the patient. So that's test number 2 complete. To move into test number 3, we need to fully disarm the defib. So we'll do that by pressing the monitor button, and we're going to return to our red master cable, where we are going to connect it to our paddles. Now obviously if you don't have paddles connected routinely, you don't need to proceed onto this test, but I would recommend that if you're ever likely to use the paddles, you should remove them periodically and perform this test just to confirm that they work. So with the paddles, we're going to connect them up at the base, and you just connect the red master cable to our paddles. And if you're trying to do this in the dark, one way to notice is that there's a raised button on your cables which indicate how it's going to fit. So just clip those two together. Now when we press the manual button, it's now coming on as a defibrillator using the external paddles. So you'll notice that you can no longer use the charge button on the screen, because we're going to use the buttons attached to the paddles themselves. Leaving the paddles in their housing, so this is again the safety discharging box. Okay, they're going to discharge into the machine itself. We're going to just press one button on the top of a paddle to charge, and it doesn't matter which button you push, just one of them, and then we're going to press and hold both to deliver the shock. And once you're happy that that second shock has been delivered, disarm your defib and return your red master cable to its original housing. Once we've been through the defibrillator, we're going to make our way through the rest of the buttons to confirm their functionality. You'll see that I've got a lot of the leads already out, because we're going to actually check that the leads work and do what they're supposed to do. So it's really helpful to make sure that you have some dummy kit to do this, and we'd recommend putting a little 373 pack together so that you can perform these tests. So your dummy kit should include a dummy temperature probe, either the invasive or the sticky dot is fine. You should have dummy end-tidal CO2 cuvettes. And also, to test your invasive leads, you can just take a transducer and literally just cut out the transducer section. That's all you need. You don't need to connect it to fluid, you don't need to run it through or anything. Just get a dummy transducer and you can connect it, and all we're going to do is zero that, so you don't need the fluid. So running through the buttons here, we've got our first button, which is the monitor button. We've already tested one of its functions to confirm that you go back into this safe screen, but the second function we're going to test is that we can change the color of the screen. So we're going to do that by pressing and holding the monitor button, and you'll see that there's a different, more of a daylight version of the screen. So this is how you're going to change that view between day and night if you need to in use. I'm going to return it back to that night view just because it's easier to see. Our next button is our pacer function. We're going to test that by pressing the pacer function, and you'll see that pacer comes up. It automatically comes on in demand mode, and all we're going to do is confirm that when I start dialing in an intensity, that the ECG recognises that the pacer is connected. So if I press this intensity button, our milliampage becomes available. I'm just going to use the jog dial to start dialing in some milliamps. It will make a loud noise, but you can see in the top screen with our ECG lead is that this STIM, so STIM, has become available. And what that's telling you is that the Corpuls knows that the pacemaker is attached and ready to go, and it's looking for a stimulation to be able to pace. So in your intensity, just confirm that it goes up to 150 and then back down to 0, effectively switches off the pacer. Next is the frequency button. So this should go all the way up to 150 again and down to 30. So just confirm that and just settle somewhere in the middle. You can change modes, so just check that you've got some modes here. So you've got a demand, a fixed and an overdrive mode if you need it. But otherwise, that's all we're going to check in the pacemaker. So we can either, if STIM is not there and there's no milliampage selected in the intensity, we can just press the monitor button to disarm that pacer and go back into our main screen. The next button is our browser button, and this is how we're going to confirm that the test that we performed on the defib actually worked. So by pressing that once, you'll start to get a printout. Once you've got everything you need, just press the print button to stop. Okay, so now we've tested that browser button and we've tested the print button. On this piece of paper, we're going to check a few things. So we're going to start off by checking that the date and time is correct to, if you're setting this to Zulu time, or if you're setting it to local time, just to confirm that all of that is correct. And we're going to work our way through these events here. So the first event that we're going to check is that the VT-VF alarm is switched on. Obviously very useful if the patient goes into VT or VF whilst being monitored, so confirm that's on. And then we're going to work our way through those 3 defibrillator checks that we performed. So the first one is that the defibrillator charged up, so we see it's got a manual charge up here and that it deactivated. The next test was through the patches, so we charged to 200 and we shocked at 207. And it's allowing, so the amount of joules that it will deliver is around about 10% above and below is absolutely fine. And the final test was via those paddles, so we charged at 200 and it delivered 208. So the defib seemed to work absolutely fine, and our browser printout has confirmed that for us. So that's all these buttons down this side. This button is our back button, so if you get stuck in a menu somewhere, then you can just press that back button to get out. And we also have a home function button. You don't really need to press those buttons very frequently because the monitor button does pretty much the same things. Down the bottom here, we have our soft keys, which will illuminate with what those keys are doing depending on what the function is that you're asking the Corpuls to perform. And it's here that we're going to start checking all of these leads. The prompt is that the first button is our non-invasive blood pressure cuff. So that's a visual clue that we're actually going to test the blood pressure cuff. So you're going to put the cuff on, you or a friend, and check that the blood pressure cuff actually functions. If you want to be kind to your friend, then you can adjust that initial inflation pressure. It's currently set to 200, so if you know your friend's blood pressure isn't anywhere near 200, then you can adjust that initial inflation pressure if you want to, or not. It's up to you. Selecting there, you can have a look to make sure that you can set a automatic blood pressure taking. So if you press the auto function, then it starts to give you some options for how many times you want to take that blood pressure and how frequently. So confirm that it takes a blood pressure successfully, and then we'll work our way through the leads. So once the blood pressure is taken, I would recommend closing that, just because you need to now be able to see the end tidal CO2 pressure wave. To check the end tidal CO2, connect up your cuvette, and then I would just place my hand over the cuvette, because I don't actually want to stick this thing in my mouth, because multiple people have done that. So just place your hand over the cuvette and just literally, all you're going to do is blow. So blow into the cuvette and confirm that you have a waveform. This will alarm at you because it thinks it's been disconnected, but just ignore it from now on. The temperature probe, we wouldn't recommend actually sticking this up anyone or in anyone to check a temperature. You know it's working because it's reading the ambient temperature of about 20 degrees. So that's fine, that works. Plug in your dummy transducers to your invasive pressure leads. And what you're going to do is, using your jog wheel, you're going to scroll down to invasive pressure and click it. In there you have a calibrate function, and this is what Corpuls calls zeroing. So select calibrate at your transducer. Obviously open it to air in the same way as you would in real life, and then just click calibrate. This is not going to work because I haven't got it connected, but if it successfully zeros, it will say calibration successful. And you'll need to do that with all the leads that you're going to work with. Finally, we're going to check that the SATS probe works. Obviously connect it to your finger, use the ear probe, connect it to an ear, and just confirm that you get some readouts on our SpO2, our pleth pulse, so a reading of a pulse from a SATS probe, and a function here called PI, which is perfusion index. So this is a function that Corpuls sold Defence, saying it would be very useful for us to indicate patients' perfusion peripherally. Most of us don't use it. It will give you a number. Lower numbers indicate poor perfusion, higher numbers indicate good perfusion, but we don't really use it. So just check for a number. And that is all the leads that we're going to check when we press that non-invasive blood pressure button. So we've checked all of our leads, and we're going to move on to our two ECG functions. So we have a ECG function here, which is our diagnostic ECG. So this is our 12 lead function. All you're going to do is press the button and confirm that a 12 lead ECG appears and that it looks like it should be in the correct order. Cancel that and come back out to our main screen, and our next button is our long-term ECG. Again, all you're going to do is confirm that long-term ECG becomes available and that you can see it. This is a really good function from Corpuls, which enables you to go back in time and spot something. So the example being, the nurse in the bedside spots a run of VT, for example, that's self-resolving, and no one believes them. Well, you can prove it because you can go into long-term ECG and scroll back in time and find that little run and print it out as a 4-lead ECG if you need to. So it's good little function there. So just confirm that it works. Next button along is our views function. We won't dwell too much on the views function because this machine is set up specifically for the views that we require in CCAST. They are good views for ITU, and in your checklist there are some notes to go through for what the views should look like. We have 3 views set up. Our first view just has 2 invasive leads. Our second view has 3 invasive leads, and our third view is our kind of a HDU view, which literally just has a ECG, SATs, and an end tidal for if you're doing that non-invasively. It's a good way of having your views set up as standard, but you'll need to refer to your unit SOPs to find out what views you will be using for your Corpuls in practice. Our next button is the QRS function. If you're someone that likes listening to the beeps, like our anaesthetic colleagues, then you can press the QRS button and you can set this to beep at you every time the patient's heart beats. Personally, we would prefer it was switched off, but it is there if you need it. At the top we have our alarm function, so pressing this button in the first instance brings up a list of the current alarms, and then you will press that to just get rid of alarms. There aren't any, so our current alarms are related to the fact that it can't pick up an end tidal, which is fine, I know about that. So I can just press it to get rid of the alarms, or I can press and hold it once and I get an alarm suspension for 2 minutes. The next button is an event marker. You can't really test this. You can press it if you want and it will come up and say event marked, but you can't really test whether it's working or not. What this enables you to do is during an adverse event, perhaps you are in a resus scenario where maybe you're giving some medication for bradycardia. Perhaps you want to mark the specific time when you gave that medication. Then you can press this event marker, and what it will do is it will just effectively put a flag on any printouts to indicate that an event occurred. It also records sound, so for about 10 seconds it records whatever you're saying. So you could say into the Corpuls, medication administered, but you're not going to ever see that because that's all held on the SD card, which needs to be downloaded by MDSS. So it's useful for a visual marker, but not so much for the rest of its functionality. You've been through all of the buttons, and the final checks are that the menus are set up correctly. To access the menu, we're just going to click the wheel. Okay, and clicking the wheel brings up all of those menu functions there. Again, we're not going to go through each one of those step by step in the video because these should be set up specific to your unit SOPs. There are some standards that we think would be useful, and they are outlined in the checklist, but it's very easy to just follow the checklist through and confirm that all of the menus are set up how you would like them. The final functional check is in the top left-hand corner of this screen. You should just confirm that you have a battery indication, and obviously if it's plugged into the mains, this is where you'll see that icon for the mains supply. And in the far corner here, we have an indication that all three modules, so the patient monitor, the box and the defibrillator, are all connected physically. So you have a blocked line to confirm that physical connection. We would recommend that you just confirm that the Bluetooth works by just unclipping that first part. And you'll see here that it will look for a little while, and then you should get a dashed line to indicate that the Bluetooth function is communicating between the patient box and the defibrillator, meaning that you can use this in its three separate modules if needed. And that concludes the 373 pre-user checks for the Corpuls. You'll have loads of time to get your hands on this piece of kit up at AMSTC for the DICE course. As you're aware, the Tempus Pro is slowly coming in and will be taking over from the Corpuls in due time, but the functionality of the Tempus for critical care use isn't quite what we would like, so you will be seeing the Corpuls for a bit longer. Thank you for watching.